Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Epley, and I recently put together a fantasy football draft tool and wanted to share that tool with kind of the rest of the world before the NFL season kicks off here in about a week and a half. I wanted to walk through the different data sources that are used for this, as well as how it can be interacted with, so that as you are going about identifying which players you might want to consider for your draft, you'll be able to look at some historical data, be able to evaluate several different types of projections so that you can have a good approach that makes sense for what you're looking to do. So with that, I want to jump into it and show you what the final dashboard looks like up on Tableau Public. So here what we can see is we can see the fantasy football draft simulator. And on this screen, what we have are two different charts that are shown, a bar chart and a scatter plot, which allow us to evaluate the level of production for different players and the level of consistency in terms of how they score. So the chart on the left, that bar chart, gives you a summary of the players either broken out and sorted by the projected number of fantasy points or based off of their average draft position, which is determined by ESPN. We could see the most highly drafted players based off of that ranking. So with this, there are several different ways that these fantasy scores are calculated. And there are three methods that are used for this. So the two simplest examples come from ESPN and FantasyPros, and I want to show you what the data for that looks like. We have ESPN's sortable ranking projections for PPR scoring. And essentially what I did is I took the stat lines that were projected. So the number of passing yards, the passing statistics, the rushing statistics, and the receiving statistics. And I pulled that in order to try and understand what would be the different levels of production for certain players. So based off of that information, that goes into a scoring method that you set as the end user to whatever your league's requirements or guidelines are. The second component is from FantasyPros. So what I did is I did the exact same thing here. So I looked at quarterbacks and all flex players, basically within anybody who had an ESPN projection is in here. I downloaded this information for all of the different players, looked at their stat lines, and then based off of those stat lines, that allowed us to have a decent idea for what to expect possibly in terms of what are kind of the pundits thinking in terms of how these players are going to produce. The last component is coming from Pro Football Reference, from their StatHead subscription service, where what I did is I basically retrieved the last 3 years worth of data. So 2020 to 2022 regular season, basically pulling back passing, rushing, receiving, special team statistics, turnover statistics in order to fill in all of the gaps when it comes to the different predictive models as you're trying to assign points to players. So with that, there were about, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of about 15,000 game logs. And the objective of the game log, and here's an example of all of the information that's in here for this. But essentially, how many do we have? We have 15,152 different lines here. But the basic goal of what I was trying to show with this using a game log projection is looking at each player's average number of fantasy points scored per game. So if they're not in the game, they're not going to get fantasy points, and trying to predict who's going to get injured or who's not going to play all 17 games. It's like flipping a coin or rolling a die. You don't know what kinds of freak injuries are going to happen or mid-season trades. We don't know what that's going to look like. So what I wanted to be able to do is look at 3 years worth of historical data, look at the mean output per game, and then based off of the score adjustment page, this tells us how many points we want to assign to each specific thing. So like, for instance, if Christian McCaffrey for the 49ers, if he catches a touchdown pass, that should be worth 6 receiving points. And since we're in a PPR league, in this example, for the ESPN standard, we get 1 point per reception. And then for every 10 yards, you get 1 point. So if he caught a 10-yard touchdown pass and that was his only reception, he would get 1 point for the reception, 6 points for the touchdown. And then because it was a 10 yards of total receiving, he would receive 1 point for that. So that one play would be worth 8 points in fantasy. So Essentially, what we do is, jumping back here to the main page, we're looking at each of the different players' historical levels of production. So like, for instance, here with Josh Allen, we see that he played 16 games in 2020, 17 in 2021, and then 16 in 2022. And what this allows us to do is, broken out by the total, the totality of all of the production and running each game log through that scoring calculation, what we're able to do is understand what would be the total number of points, and then what would be the total number of games. So we get an average points per game. And then from there, what we're doing is we're basically saying, we don't know how many games Josh Allen is going to play, but if he produces at the level he has produced historically, what will be the amount of, if he keeps that average from the last 3 years, if he keeps that and maintains that, where will he end up sitting in terms of total production, in terms of total points? So we take all of the points that he would have generated over, those roughly 45 games, and then we divide that by the 40 some odd games, and that gives us our average points, which in his case is 22.7. Based off of this information, we're able to, at a glance, get a bit of an idea for which players are projected to be high producers. What's very cool about this tool is that you can click these different drop downs and you could say, well, I want to look at what ESPN's projections are in terms of the yardage, in terms of the touchdowns, in terms of all of those different things. This is going to take a second because it's swapping out a parameter reference, and we can see Patrick Mahomes is projected based off of those numbers to be the top scorer in leagues. And there's not a huge difference between Josh Allen in the game log method and the ESPN method. And we could also jump over and see, what does FantasyPros think? There we go. So it's projecting that Patrick Mahomes having a really, really solid year this year, averaging almost 24 points, which is fantastic. But jumping back to our game logs real quick, there are instances where players don't have game logs, namely rookies. As I was kind of running through the first rendition of this, Bijan Robinson, former running back from University of Texas, he's one of the higher rated running backs in the league for the Atlanta Falcons, but he has no historical game logs to go off of. So what do we do in that case? In the event that a player did not have a game log, essentially what we did is we allow ourselves to specify, who do we want to reference for that? Do we want to reference ESPN's projections, or do we want to reference FantasyPros for that? So if there's a player who's just come onto the scene, or maybe they were drafted a year or two ago, but now they're getting the nod to start, this would allow us to ensure that we're referencing what we want to reference for that. That allows us to understand kind of how to fill in the gaps in this data so you don't miss a good player possibly. So that's the left portion, the bar chart, and I want to talk about the portion on the right here. So the portion on the right is the average points per game versus something that is known as the coefficient of variation. So the coefficient of variation, basically what you're doing is you're comparing the standard deviation of the game scores. So like with Josh Allen, he was averaging somewhere in the ballpark of 22, 23 points per game. He's not doing a consistent 22 to 23. What he's doing is there's going to be one game where he throws a couple extra touchdown passes, or a couple where maybe he throws an interception or two, and his scores will fluctuate. Essentially, when you have a data set and you take a standard deviation of that data, in this case that would be relevant to Josh Allen, you'd be able to calculate his standard deviation, which is just a statistical measure to evaluate how much variability there is. If you take that standard deviation and divide that by the average number of points that, in this case, Josh Allen is projected to score, you'd get what's known as the coefficient of variation. A coefficient of variation that is near zero is fantastic, because that means that the standard deviation is very low, or the level of production with respect to that standard deviation is very high. Like what we can see here, Josh Allen, based off of the game logs, has the highest points per game, and out of the 100 or so dots that are displayed here, out of the 500 and some odd players, he has a coefficient of variation of 0.34, which is the best out of everybody that's listed here. So based off of this means that approximately 1/3 of the amount of, let's say he's averaging 24 points a game, and he has a 0.33 coefficient of variation, that would be basically representing a 6-point standard deviation swing. So we could expect that he's going to probably fall somewhere within that range over the course of based off of the game log that's projected to happen. With that, what we're able to do is we're able to see that the players that are in the upper left, those are the better players. They have higher average points per game, and they're more consistent at that level of production. The players in the lower right with the smaller bubbles, they are less consistent. They have a lot more variability in terms of how consistent their production level is. With that, what I want to do is I want to demonstrate some of the functionality and capability that comes with this. Obviously, we have our score adjustment tab, which I showed earlier, but we also have, when we hover over a player, we can see a bunch of different metrics and statistics. We're able to see different ranks. We're able to see how often this player is in the ESPN fantasy draft metrics. And then based off of the game logs that we pull in, we're able to see the level of production and kind of where this player is getting their average points from. So we can see Josh Allen, his most positive passing year was in 2020 when he had almost 19 points for passing, 5 on the ground, a half. He must have had like a catching touchdown or something. So he averaged almost 24 points in 2020. Based off of this, what we're able to understand is that he has a high level of production. If we go over Devontae Adams, who had a very stellar season with the Packers a couple of years ago, actually 2, I think, where he had 25 fantasy points per game based off of the metrics we've got, and then 21 the next, and then 19. So he's been very consistent. We can see that pretty much all of the points that he's getting are coming from receiving. So this allows us to understand if we're drafting a player, let's say Christian McCaffrey, what we can see is that when he was with Carolina, he's only played in this data set 27 games over 3 years. So he had some injuries that he was dealing with. But when he was with Carolina, he was a very strong rushing back. And his receiving has been very consistent in terms of where he's gotten his points. So he's had a drop off in terms of his rushing production, but that's been fairly decently well balanced by everything else. So that helps us understand a little bit about the tooltip capability, and those tooltips are identical on this page in terms of what you will see. But the cool capability that comes with this is when you click on, let's say, first round, we're up first round pick, and we're like, you know what, I really want to draft Patrick Mahomes. We can click add him to my team, and that will actually pull him off of the draft board. As if you're following along with this, and let's say that, so this is running calculations to strip him out, then let's say that the next person, they are a really big fan of the Vikings. I live in Minnesota, and they hover over this and they draft Justin Jefferson, and we can just click and say remove Justin Jefferson. And what that does is that will basically pull him off of the list of eligible players. So then you'd go out down the line. You might be thinking, okay, that's cool, but what's the value of this? How am I supposed to track who my team is? I built in a capability called the Team Analysis tab, where what it's doing is it is basically building that list of players that you're drafting, and it is showing you an analysis of who did you draft, what is the composition of your team. Are you drafting players who are very high in terms of their average points per game and very low in their coefficient of variation? What are you doing in terms of that, as well as some summary statistics about who else is out there, as well as some of the best available players. So if, we've gone around the board, a bunch of these really good players are still on there, and we say, you know what, we really want to pick up Christian McCaffrey, we hover over him, add him to our team, and what we can see here on this visualization is we can see the composition of our team up here once it adds Christian. And then as soon as we get 2+ players, it'll start to plot out a line here, basically of understanding what is our coefficient of variation. So this is taking a second to load because it's running a bunch of stuff in the background to remove him from that list of eligible players and add him to our team. So that is thinking for a bit. No, we lost connectivity there. So let's reconnect real quick. Let's see if it kept our selections or if we're back at the main screen. Yep, our changes did not save. So that's one of the caveats with using the web-based tool. If you have Tableau Public, I would encourage you to actually download this so that you can have it as you're going through your draft if you've got capability to access a computer, however you're drafting. But let's add Patrick Mahomes to our team. So let's click him, add him to our team. And then, so that's going to run, that's going to add him. Christian McCaffrey, let's add him to our team. And then let's say, Travis Kelce's off the board. Let's say that we really liked the production of Mark Andrews last year with the Ravens, so we want to add him to our team. And what we can see as we are drafting our players is we get a bit of our summary here broken out by, who are going to be your top contributors on the roster. We get a little bit of an idea for if we're trying to schedule around certain bye weeks, which weeks do we want to potentially avoid? So this helps us understand that a little bit around what we have already on our team, so that as we're looking to draft somebody else, if we see that, okay, this person if we're looking to draft a backup quarterback, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a week 10 quarterback unless he's statistically doing a really great job or highly projected to do really well, or then we'd have to pull someone out of the waiver wire to act as our starter, which we might not get the best player. But with that, we've got a couple of different components here. So down here, we have the best available. So broken out by the 4 major positions of quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. What we have is basically, it's running through all of the different calculations, and it's basically saying, here are the top 8, in this case, players in each position for our draft. So if we've gone through 10 rounds and we're the 11th round and we're just trying to find someone who we think might be a steal, we get the best recommended players right up at the top. So that helps us make decisions quickly if we've got very short rounds, but that adds value for people who are drafting. But then we have this component down here where we get a little bit of a summary broken out by position group and also by player. So let's add Deshaun Watson, let's add Joe Mixon, and let's add Jamar Chase. So we're going to be Bengals heavy. Who day? And let's add Zach Ertz to this as well. Let's also add DeAndre Hopkins from the Titans. And let's add Nick Chubb too. So what we can see in this donut chart in the lower right is of the players that we've selected, broken down by position group, we can see the average points per game in terms of how it's sized. And what that allows us to see is, do we have which position is our strongest position? So we've got Patrick Mahomes, who is one of the top players at the quarterback position, so that's solid. We got Christian McCaffrey to lead the running back room. We've got Jamar Chase and DeAndre Hopkins working in our wide receiver core. And this allows us to see a little bit of a picture of where are our points projected to come from, possibly. In addition to this, we can see game log variation. Basically, the bigger the slice is here, that's a good thing. I basically inverted the value. So if you picked somebody, let's jump back to our main page really quickly, and let's find someone who's got a lot of variability, who's not very good. So let's find someone with a bit of a crazy stat line. And let's say we want Khalil Herbert, who has a coefficient of variation of 1.17. So let's add him to our team, and then we will jump back. Actually, let's add one more. Let's add Cooper Rush, the backup to Dak, or maybe not at the time that I'm recording this. We'll see. So those players are now added to our roster. And as we jump back to our team analysis, then we can see we've got those players here. So Cooper Rush is this really small slice in this case, because he has a higher coefficient of variation based off of the variability in his scores compared to the number of points that he typically scores. So yeah, he's only projected to score 6 points. Historically, he's only averaged about 6 because he's only played in 12 games. So with that, then what we can do is we could change this also if we're just trying to understand the breakout by the number of picks. So we got 3 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 2 tight ends. We need to bulk up our wide receiver room for our flex position depending on our league. But what this tool allows you to do is essentially tweak different things. So if you're the general manager and you are trying to kind of figure out who you might want on your team, and you're contemplating tweaking some rules and say, you know what, I want to give some points here for 300-yard passing game. If we look historically, and let's say we give them a 5-point bonus for a 300-yard passing game, and then a 5-point bonus for a 400+ yard passing game. And we jump straight back to our team analysis page. This is going to look at all of those different things. So Patrick Mahomes, his number has increased, and all of the different things in the tooltips as well. Basically, it reran it and said this is how many points he would have contributed, broken out by season. This is essentially what the tool does. It's very flexible. It doesn't have everything, because some of the statistics from Pro Football Reference, like specifically around like kickoff stuff, punt return stuff, fumble stuff, the fumbles lost field wasn't really there. here when I was doing the search. So it's just broken on the number of fumbles, which I think ESPN scores it as a -2 for fumbles lost. So maybe you do fumbles -1 in that case. Or if you've got somebody like, let's say, Nwangu, the returner for the Vikings. If you've got somebody like him and you're thinking about adding him as a running back and then throwing him as either like the running back 2 or running back 3, depending on your composition for your league, and then thinking about, okay, how can we go about positioning him in? Like, none of the other tools forecasted his capabilities here in terms of that. So let's go find him real quick, and I'll show an additional filter capability here. All right, so position group, running back. And there are filters for each of the different positions on their own, and then there's flex as well. So what that allows you to see is that gets rid of the quarterbacks. So let's find Kene Nwangu. Where is he? There he is. Yeah, he's only projected to give us 20 points. So what we can see here is that 2 years ago in the 9 games he played, he averaged 1.3 special teams kind of net other points. That could be a factor as you're looking to compare a couple of different players for who traditionally maybe is being used on 2-point conversion plays. So there's a bunch of different components to this, which would allow you to evaluate what are the different situations that we're seeing here, so that as you're in the process of evaluating and comparing different players that are still on your board, that would allow you to analyze that. That is essentially the nature of this project and the nature of this dashboard and how it all works. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at @EpleySamuel, or reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to chat about how I built this. If you've got specific questions, feel free to download it off of Tableau Public for your own draft day use, or if you're just trying to understand the logic of how did I build these different things. So my name is Sam Epley. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.